Hello, welcome to this Complete Beginner Whittling Lesson. This will be part 3 of our Simple Cactus lesson, in which we have been whittling a cactus, simple cactus like this, from a piece of 1 by 1 by 3 wood. And this is where we're at this point from parts 1 and 2, and so we'll be going from here to here, and you'll see the big difference here is that we're going to be adding these notches in as part of what we're doing for part 3. Actually, pretty much all of what we're doing for part 3. So, our learning goals for this lesson are that you will be able to successfully perform V-cuts and that you will use V-cuts to texture a project. And so this video is really going to be all about making V-cuts, and this entire project has been kind of a vehicle to get to practicing V-cuts on what I think is a simple and fun project that you'll actually use. So let me show you first what a V-cut is. So if I grab a piece of wood here, at a basic level, what a V-cut is when I carve from one side this way and then the other side down until they meet and that pops out. And what I've created is a cut that's shaped like a V, right? So that's a V-cut. Now it's different than a stop cut and a push cut, because with a stop cut and a push cut, the stop cut's generally going to be straight, kind of flat in there, and I'm going to be creating more of a perpendicular line. The V-cut is going to create, just like it sounds like, that nice V. So it's a push into the wood one way, and then you go kind of the same distance up from the other side and cut back down toward it. And if you do that perfectly, you'll make 2 cuts and it'll come out cleanly. If you don't do it perfectly, like I did there, you'll repeat the cuts and then it'll come out. And then you might want to clean it up a little bit further. And one tip that I might give you as you're doing V-cuts like this is that it might be a little bit easier to put a little stop cut in where your V-cut is going to go. And that might help with making clean cuts. So I'm going to put just a little stop cut there. And now I'm going to try my V-cut. That helps me know where to stop, and if I come from the other side, it helps me know where to stop. Okay, so that's a V-cut. Now there are different types of V-cuts that might vary a little bit, but at its core, I think that's the simplest way to think about a V-cut. You could do it vertically like this, and so I have other plant projects, like this one would be an example where I'm doing a really long vertical V-cut on something like this, but at its core, it's still a V-cut. You could also do something like with the tip of your knife and do a cut down a side like this, and then a cut like this. And I'll have to do that a second time because they didn't quite come together. And you could say, well, that's a V-cut, and that is a V-cut, and it's a different type of V-cut that we're not really going to be covering in this video today. So back to our cactus project, what we're going to do is just use a whole bunch of V-cuts in order to add texture and interest to our cactus. So to do that, let's just choose one of these hard corners. And this is part of why we left the hard corners here. It's going to be easy for us to see where to put our V-cuts. And I think the V-cuts in the horizontal direction across the vertical facets here, it just looks cool. Just looks cool. So I'm going to find one of these hard corners, and if I go halfway between that line where I started tapering in on the bottom and the line where I started tapering in on the top, I'm going to make a V-cut right in the middle here. And I'm going to go ahead and make just a little stop cut, and then I'm going to carve up to it from the bottom and down to it from the top. Repeat if you need to get it out. And there we go. There's my first one. I'm going to do another one halfway between this one and that top line. And I do think it's easy to use that little stop cut in the middle like that. I'm going to make another one. I'm going to go halfway between that and the bottom one. And I'm going to make another one. Okay. So there's 3 V-cuts for that side. Now, just to add some interest in a nice pattern here, what we're going to do on the next one is that we're going to do 4 V-cuts on the next one. We're going to stagger them. So if you want, we can start on this top line, and I'm going to put a little stop cut right exactly on that top line. I'm going to put my first little V-cut up there, right on that line. I'm going to put my next one on the bottom, right on that line. Right there. And then I'm going to put my other two right in between the ones that were next to it. So I'm going to put a little stop cut there for reference, and then make another one here. And I'm going to do another one here. And now I've got 4 on that row. Okay. Now, some things to think about while you practice this, and I'm going to just keep going because we've got 2 of 8 corners done. And on this one, I'm going to go back to 3, so I'll start in the middle and do that. So things to think about while you're practicing this. One is how big do you want to make these? Well, I'm making these fairly small. I'm trying to make sure they don't extend across each other. And as you're practicing, it's probably good to practice making kind of uniform sizes. But if you're doing this for the very first time, your cuts are going to come out not quite exactly uniform, and that's okay. And mine aren't exactly uniform either. There's going to be a little bit of variation to them. It's easy to get into a thing where you start to angle this too far one way or the other, so try to keep them straight perpendicular. And after you do a few, you might start to get consistent in the size that you're doing. But if you got some that are bigger and some that are smaller, that's fine. It's just going to give you a different look to your finished product. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing. If you make these really big, you can get some interesting patterns. I can show you here real quick. Here's one I was kind of playing around. It's the same pattern, but really, really deep ones that come across there, right? It doesn't really look like a cactus anymore, but it does look super cool. So I would keep these relatively small. It's good for your first attempt. Use the upper end of your knife probably on this, the tip. It's going to be smaller, which will make those deeper cuts without cracking the wood, and should be a pretty simple cut to make once you've practiced it a while. And the whole point of this is that you're going to need to practice in order to make clean cuts. And so this project, in addition to giving you some cool shaping tips, is really all about adding this V-cut to your repertoire. So in the first project, we focused on those stop cuts and push cuts. But this V-cut you'll use all over the place. So if you look at that shape, you can envision that a V-cut is often kind of the basis of what an eye socket might look like. It's the basis of a lot of the texturing that I would put into a beard, although I would generally use a different tool called a V-tool to do that, just because it's a little easier. But you can use V-cuts to texture a beard or hair on your carvings. And it just gives you a simple way to add texture and interest to your carvings. And I really feel like the texture you add to your carvings is often what really adds the interest when you're done with it. So there, that wasn't too bad. If you're a complete beginner, that might take you a little bit, but that's the point. Practice all of those V-cuts. I've got 4 on one side, and then 3, and then 4, and then 3. That alternating pattern is really nice. Now, one last thing before we wrap this up then is you've got some pencil marks on here. A couple things you could do with that. You could try to erase them. You may or may not have success with that, depending on how strong your pencil is, how good your eraser is, and that kind of thing. If you got a special art eraser, that might help a little bit. You could try washing them off, or what I often do is if I see them places, I'll just run my knife straight along that straight edge where it is, and I'll just shave them off. Like that. Okay, so you might want to run around the outside of your carving and make sure that you've removed those pencil marks. I'm not going to do all of them right now. before you're done. But that's it. That's your cactus, and I think it's just a fun, interesting pattern to follow. So I hope you learned a lot in that lesson. There's an example of it painted all up. Really simple to make. Really simple to finish, and that's it. You've completed, if you're following along in the series, you've completed your second brand new Complete Beginner Whittling project. Based on the skills that you have, I do want to mention you could take these skills and you could apply them to other things. So I'm going to show you this one here, which I pulled out before. You can probably figure out how to make this now with the skills you have. So what I do on this one, and if you ignore the pattern on the bottom, you don't have to worry about that yet, but I changed the entire block into a cylinder, right? So you can see that circular from the top or bottom. And then I use the exact same method to kind of add stop cut and go into that for the base that you do here. Actually very similar to what we did on the little people, and then a similar method to round off the top. I used a method here that would leave very large, wide facets, and then instead of doing, you know, horizontal stop cuts like we did on the plant we just made, I'm just doing vertical stop cuts. And those are a little bit bigger, a little bit longer, and then alternating some in between. So you could use the skills you have right now to try that, minus the chip carved base. You could do that. Another example would be this one, and you could do something like this and apply the skills you have so far to do that as well. The base here is actually essentially the same as the one we just made. The only difference is that there's some kind of flared, I've kind of flared the sides to just add a little more interest to it, but very similar. And then you could probably figure out how to separate that into 3 sections. And then this is all long, narrow, horizontal V-cuts overlapping with each other to make that pattern. So this is your simple, basic one. But given the skills that you've got now, you could probably apply that to make some of these other ones, or come up with your own patterns, which is part of the fun of it. So that's it. Thanks for following along and watching, and happy whittling.